The icy midday wind cut like a knife. Ethan Carter pulled his cart loaded with firewood along the snow-covered path, feeling the weight of every log in his tired arms. The mountains around him gleamed white under the winter sun, beautiful but merciless. He had left his ranch at dawn, and now, 3 hours later, he had barely covered half the return journey. His numb hands forced him to stop. He needed warmth, even if only for a few minutes. With precise movements born from years on the frontier, he gathered dry branches sticking out of the snow, took out his flint, and within minutes had a small fire crackling. The smoke rose straight into the clear sky. Ethan stretched his hands over the flames, sighing in relief as he prepared coffee in his old dented tin. That was when he saw them, 4 small figures moving slowly among the trees about 100 meters away. Ethan squinted. A woman and 3 children were struggling along, sinking into the snow with every step. Even from that distance he could see they were shivering. The woman stopped, looking toward the smoke from his fire. For a long moment no one moved. Then the woman took her children by the hands and began walking toward him. Ethan didn't move, he simply waited, watching. As they got closer, he could see more details. The woman wore traditional Apache clothing, worn and patched. Her children, 2 girls and a boy, had thin faces and enormous eyes. The youngest, who barely seemed 5 years old, was limping. The woman stopped a few meters from the fire. Her dark eyes studied Ethan cautiously, assessing the danger. He could see the internal battle on her face, pride versus need, fear versus desperation. Finally, she spoke, her voice clear but with a marked accent. "Can we warm ourselves?" 3 simple words, 3 words that changed everything. Ethan looked at the children's faces, purple lips, stiff fingers. The little boy was crying silently, tears frozen on his cheeks. He remembered another winter years ago when he himself had been lost in the snow. An old trapper had saved him by sharing his fire without asking questions. "The fire is for everyone," Ethan replied, moving aside. "Come, sit down." The woman hesitated only a second before guiding her children toward the warmth. They sat together, huddled close, stretching their hands toward the flames. Ethan poured hot coffee into his only cup and offered it to the woman. She shook her head and gave it to the oldest child, who drank with trembling hands. "My name is Ethan Carter," he said, taking hard bread from his satchel and breaking it into pieces. He offered them the food. This time the woman didn't refuse. "Shima," she replied simply, watching her children devour the bread. For several minutes no one spoke. There was only the crackle of the fire, the whistle of the wind through the pines, and the sound of the children chewing. Ethan added more wood, making the flames grow. Color began to return to the small faces. "Where are you going?" Ethan asked finally. Shima looked south toward the distant mountains, to find family, tribe. Ethan followed her gaze. He knew those mountains. The journey would take days, maybe weeks, especially with children. And the sky, though clear now, had that milky tone on the horizon that he knew all too well. "It's going to snow," he said, pointing to the clouds gathering in the distance. "A lot," Shima nodded. She already knew, but moving forward was her only option. The youngest girl curled up against her mother, finally stopping her shivering. The middle child, a girl of about 7, looked at Ethan with curiosity, unafraid. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 9, kept his eyes down, trying to be invisible. Ethan offered them more bread. This time Shima also ate, though only a small bite. A mother, Ethan thought, always giving everything to her children first. The fire burned strong now, creating a small circle of warmth in the vast frozen landscape. At that moment, in that place, 2 worlds met, a lone cowboy and an Apache mother with her children, strangers bound by the most basic need, surviving the cold. None of them knew that this encounter by the fire would change their lives forever, that the simple question, "Can we warm ourselves?" was the beginning of something bigger than any of them could imagine. As the sun began its descent and storm clouds slowly approached from the mountains, Ethan made a decision. "My ranch is 2 hours from here," he said. "Stay the night. Tomorrow at sunrise you can continue on your way." Shima looked into his eyes, searching for deceit, for danger. She found only weariness and something else, understanding. She nodded slowly. And so, as the first clouds covered the sun and the temperature began to drop, 5 people set out toward an uncertain destination. Morning arrived, cold but clear. Ethan woke up in his kitchen, where he had spent the night wrapped in blankets. From the guest room no sound came. Shima and her children were still asleep, exhausted from days of walking in the cold. He got up silently and made coffee. The aroma filled the house. As he looked out the window, he studied the sky. Yesterday's clouds had dissipated overnight, but on the western horizon he saw something he didn't like, a dark, dense line approaching slowly. He knew those clouds. They brought snow, lots of snow. An hour later he heard movement in the room. Shima appeared in the doorway with the youngest child asleep in her arms. Her eyes showed shame and gratitude at the same time. "Good morning," Ethan said, pointing to the hot coffee. "Is there fresh bread as well?" Shima nodded, carefully placing the child in a chair. The 2 girls appeared behind her, looking at everything with big, curious eyes. Ethan's house was simple but solid. Thick log walls, a stone fireplace, windows with real glass, rare in these lands. They ate breakfast in silence. Ethan noticed how Shima ate little, making sure her children had enough. When they finished, she stood with determination. "We must go," she said, her voice firm. "We have already abused your kindness." Ethan looked out the window again. The dark clouds were closer. It's going to snow heavily now, he warned. Maybe you should wait another day. But Shima shook her head, pride shone in her eyes. They had accepted his help for one night, but staying longer would be too much. They were not beggars, they were not a burden to anyone. We will be fine, she replied, beginning to gather the few belongings they had. Ethan didn't insist. He understood pride, he respected it. He helped prepare provisions, bread, dried meat, an extra blanket that he insisted they take. Shima accepted everything with silent dignity. Half an hour later he watched them leave, 4 small figures walking south, sinking into the snow with every step. He stood on his porch, watching until they disappeared among the trees. A feeling of unease settled in his chest. He went back inside and tried to work. He repaired harnesses, sharpened tools, but his eyes kept returning to the window, to those clouds, growing blacker, coming closer. At noon, the first flakes began to fall, soft at first, almost beautiful as they floated in the air. Ethan went out to bring more wood from the shed. The wind had changed direction, now blowing from the north, bringing Arctic air. An hour later, he could no longer see his barn. Snow fell so thick that the world had become a white curtain. The wind howled around the house, shaking the windows. This was no ordinary snowfall, it was a fierce, dangerous storm. Ethan paced back and forth, restless. He thought of Shima and her children out there, somewhere in that deadly whiteness. They had perhaps a 2-hour head start. Had they found shelter, a grove of trees, a cave? The wind blew harder now, making the house groan. Ethan added wood to the fire, trying not to imagine 4 small figures lost in the storm. Then he heard something, a sound almost lost in the howl of the wind. Knocks on the door, weak, desperate. He ran to the entrance and yanked it open. A blast of snow and wind rushed in, and there on his porch stood Shima and her children, completely covered in snow, shaking violently. The little boy was crying. The girls clung to their mother, their lips blue. We couldn't find the way, Shima said through chattering teeth. Everything is white. Sorry, we're sorry. Inside, quick. Ethan shouted over the wind. He gently pushed them inside and shut the door against the storm. Shima nearly collapsed, holding herself against the wall. Her children clung to her, all soaked, freezing. Ethan didn't waste time. Years of surviving on the frontier had taught him what to do. He grabbed blankets, placed them in front of the fire. With firm but gentle hands, he removed the children's wet coats and wrapped them in dry blankets. Sit close to the fire, he ordered. He prepared hot tea, forcing them to drink in small sips. Shima tried to speak, tried to apologize, but he raised his hand. Now, he said simply, warm yourselves. Outside, the storm raged with growing fury. Snow piled against the windows. The wind shook the house like a wild animal trying to get in. But inside, by the fire, 4 people slowly began to thaw. The little boy stopped crying. The girls huddled together under a shared blanket. Shima closed her eyes, exhausted beyond words. Ethan added more wood to the fire and looked out the window. He could see nothing but white. This storm would last days. He knew it for certain. He turned toward his unexpected guests. Shima opened her eyes and looked at him. In that gaze there was gratitude, yes, but also something else, the terrible understanding that they were now trapped here. Not for one night, not by choice. They were stranded, forced to stay in a stranger's house, dependent on his kindness. For a proud woman like Shima, this was almost worse than the cold. But as she looked at her children's faces, now safe and warm, she knew there was no other option. Outside, the snow kept falling and falling. The storm did not stop. For 2 full days, the snow fell without rest. The world outside Ethan's windows became an endless white sea. Flakes piled against the house's walls, rising hour by hour until the lower windows were completely covered. Shima was tense. Ethan could see it in the way she held her shoulders and how her eyes avoided his. Shame consumed her. They had come back. They had failed to leave. Now they were a burden. The first day, she barely spoke. She sat in a corner with her children, taking up as little space as possible, as if she could make herself invisible. She refused food until Ethan simply left plates near her and walked away. Only then did she eat small bites, making sure her children got most of it, but he wasn't foolish. He understood pride. He also understood something more important. If they were going to be trapped together for days, they needed to find a balance. On the second morning when Shima got up, she found that Ethan had left clothes to mend on the table, pants with holes, shirts with missing buttons, socks that needed darning. He was outside bringing in firewood, acting as if nothing was amiss. Shima looked at the clothes for a long moment, then slowly she picked up a needle and thread. When Ethan returned, covered in snow, she was working in silence. He said nothing, simply nodded and began making breakfast. That small gesture changed everything. Shima was no longer just a guest, she was someone contributing. Her shame began to diminish. The children, meanwhile, had lost their initial fear. Children are adaptable, resilient. The little one whom Shima called Tasa had discovered Ethan's tool drawer. He spent hours looking at the hammers and nails, fascinated. The girls, Nita and Kaya, explored the house with growing curiosity. On the third day, the snow finally began to diminish. Ethan opened the front door with effort, pushing against the snow wall. He managed to create a small path to the barn. The children followed him, sinking up to their knees in the deep snow, laughing for the first time. In the barn, Ethan had 2 horses. One was his workhorse, big and strong. The other was older, gentle. The children froze at the sight of them. Do you want to touch them? Ethan asked. Tassa nodded vigorously. Kaya, the oldest, stepped back protectively, but Nita, the middle one, approached bravely. Ethan guided her small hand toward the soft muzzle of the old horse. His name is Buck, he explained. He's 20 years old, very calm. Nita stroked Buck in wonder. The horse snorted softly, making the girl laugh. That sound, children's laughter in his silent barn, made something move in Ethan's chest, something that had been asleep for years. That night, gathered around the fire after dinner, Shima finally spoke more than scattered words. The children had fallen asleep, curled up in blankets near the warmth. She and Ethan sat at opposite ends, drinking tea. My husband, she began quietly, went hunting 6 moons ago. He did not return. Her Spanish was halting but clear. We waited, searched, nothing. Ethan listened in silence, watching the flames. The tribe has little food this winter, many mouths. I decided to go south, find my mother's family. I thought, her voice broke slightly. I thought I could do it alone. You are doing it, Ethan said softly. Your children are alive, they are here, that's what matters. Shima looked at him in surprise. In her culture, her world, she had failed. She had to ask for help. She had to accept charity from a stranger. But this man saw strength where she saw weakness. You, she asked. Family? Ethan took a moment to answer. I had a wife, a baby. 5 years ago, fever, they died in 3 days. The words came out flat, emotionless, but Shima could see the old pain in his eyes. She understood. Both had lost, both were alone, both were surviving. This place, Shima said, looking around the house, very quiet for you. Yes, Ethan admitted, very quiet. For a moment, only the crackle of the fire filled the space between them. Two people, two different worlds, bound by loss and loneliness. Tomorrow, Shima said, I cook food of my people, thank you. Ethan nodded. I would like that. The fourth day dawned clear. The sky was an impossible bright blue, the kind of blue that only appears after great storms. Snow covered everything in a perfect, virgin, dazzlingly white blanket under the sun. Shima made Apache-style cornbread using Ethan's supplies but her people's techniques. The aroma filled the house, different, wonderful. The children helped, mixing, kneading. Even Tassa joined in, his little hands making a mess but full of joy. When they ate together, something was different in the air. They were no longer a stranger and his uncomfortable guests. They were people sharing a space, sharing food, sharing life. Outside on the hills beyond, Ethan noticed something that chilled his blood for reasons different from the snow. Smoke from his nearest neighbor's farm, Thomas Brennan. Thomas had seen his smoke too, and would soon come to investigate why Ethan was burning so much wood, why there were so many small footprints in the snow around his house. The peace of these isolated days was about to end. On the fifth day, Ethan was chopping wood behind the house when he heard the sound of hooves on compacted snow. He straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. He knew that sound. Someone was coming. He walked around the house just in time to see Thomas Brennan dismounting from his horse. Thomas was a large man with a reddish beard and hands like hams. He had a farm 5 kilometers to the east. He was Ethan's closest neighbor. And though they weren't close friends, they helped each other when needed. Ethan, Thomas called, his voice echoing in the cold air. Came to see how you survived the storm. That was a beast, huh? Survived fine, Ethan replied, walking toward him. He could hear movement inside the house. Shima had heard the unfamiliar voice. Thomas tied his horse and stomped toward the porch, shaking snow from his boots. My wife sent me with bread. She knows you live alone and thought. He stopped abruptly. He had looked through the window. Inside, clearly visible, were Shima and her 3 children. Shima stood by the stove with Tassa clutching her skirt. The 2 girls played with wooden blocks that Ethan had carved for them. Thomas turned slowly to Ethan. His face showed pure surprise. Ethan, who are those people? Ethan kept his voice calm, controlled. They are my guests. I found them on the road before the storm. They got trapped here. Guests. Thomas lowered his voice, though his eyes darted nervously toward the window. Ethan, that's an Apache woman and Apache children in your house. I know who they are, and you're hosting them here. Disapproval in Thomas's voice was as clear as spring water. Ethan felt his jaw tighten but kept his tone neutral. They were going to freeze to death, Thomas. What did you want me to do? Leave them to die in the snow? Thomas took off his hat, running a hand through his hair. No, of course not, but these are different people. There's history here, trouble. This woman and these children haven't caused any trouble yet. Thomas raised his hands. Look, I understand your kindness, but things have been tense. There was that attack on the wagon train last month further west. People are nervous, and now you've got Apache living with you. Staying temporarily, Ethan corrected firmly, until they can continue their journey. Thomas looked toward the window again. Inside, Shima had picked up Tassa and moved to the back of the house, away from view. She knew exactly what this conversation meant. Ethan, I'm your friend, Thomas said more softly. I'm warning you. When people in town hear about this, there will be talk, questions. It's not simple. There are families who lost people in conflicts. There's fear, and fear makes people do what? Ethan's voice had an edge now. Attack a woman and 3 small children. Is that what you're saying? No, God, no. I'm just saying this is going to cause trouble for you, for them too. Ethan crossed his arms. I appreciate your concern, Thomas, but as long as they're under my roof, no one is going to hurt them. Understood. Thomas studied his neighbor's face. He saw determination there, hard as rock. He sighed heavily. You're a stubborn man, Ethan Carter. I'm a man who doesn't let children die in the snow. They stood in silence for a long moment. Thomas's horse snorted, shaking its head. Finally, Thomas put his hat back on. All right, but Ethan, be careful. And when they leave, make sure they actually leave. You can't," he searched for the right words. "You can't make this permanent, understand?" Ethan didn't respond. Thomas mounted his horse, looking down at his neighbor. "The bread is in my saddlebag. Next time I go to town, I'll probably keep quiet about this, but someone else will come eventually, and they might not be as understanding as me." "Thanks for the warning." Thomas nodded, turned his horse, and began to ride away. After a few yards, he stopped and looked back. "Ethan, one more thing. Whatever you're doing here, just think it through. Think about what it means, not just for you, but for them too." Then he left, his horse trotting down the snow-covered path, leaving deep tracks. Ethan stood on his porch, watching until Thomas disappeared among the trees. He knew his neighbor was right about one thing: this would cause trouble. It already was. He turned toward the house. Through the window, he could see Shima standing in the shadows, watching. She had heard everything. She might not have understood every word, but she understood the tone, the danger. When Ethan came inside, Shima faced him with firm eyes. "We must go," she said. "Tomorrow. Cause trouble for you." The children looked at her with big, frightened eyes. Tassa began to cry softly. Ethan closed the door behind him and took off his coat. Slowly, he walked to the window, looking at the snow that still covered everything deeply. "The snow is still very high," he said finally. "The mountain passes are closed. You wouldn't make it 5 kilometers before getting trapped again. But your neighbor, my neighbor, is my problem, not yours." Shima shook her head. "No, we are problem. I knew it. We are always problem." The bitterness in her voice cut like a knife. Ethan turned to look at her directly. "You are not the problem," he said firmly. "The problem is people who judge without knowing. People who see enemies where there is only a mother and her children." "You are not afraid," Shima asked, "of what others will say?" Ethan thought of his wife, his baby, the lonely graves behind his house. He thought of 5 years of silence, of loneliness, of a house too big for one man. "I've lost the things that mattered to me," he said. "I'm no longer scared of the words of strangers." The following days were strange. The snow began to melt slowly under a warmer sun, but the ice in Shima's heart took longer to thaw. She knew they had to leave. Every passing day made the situation more complicated for Ethan. But every morning when she looked out the window, she saw that the snow was still too deep. The roads were still impassable, and deep in her heart, in a place she didn't want to admit, she felt relief. Her children were happy. Tassa followed Ethan everywhere like a puppy, imitating the cowboy's every move. Nita had completely lost her shyness and sang Apache songs while helping her mother. Kaya, the oldest, had begun to smile, something Shima hadn't seen in months. One afternoon, while Ethan repaired a harness at the table, Tassa approached him timidly. "Mr. Ethan," the boy said in his halting Spanish. "Can I help?" Ethan looked at the 5-year-old. "Sure, come here." He gave Tassa a piece of soft leather and taught him to make simple knots. The boy worked with his tongue sticking out in concentration, his little fingers struggling with the material. When he finally managed to make a knot, his face lit up with pride. Shima watched from the kitchen, and something inside her broke. Tassa didn't remember his father. He had been too small when the man disappeared. But here, watching her son with Ethan, she saw something that both broke and healed her heart. At the same time, she saw what her children needed, what she needed: a safe place, a home. That night after the children were asleep, Shima gathered her courage. "Ethan," she began, "I need to say something." He looked up from his coffee. "I'm listening. When the snow goes, we will go, I promise." But she took a deep breath. "I can work while we are here, earn our stay. I don't want to be a burden." Ethan put his cup on the table. "Shima, you already work. You cook, you clean, you mend. You do more than enough." "It is not enough. You give shelter, food, safety. I only do house tasks." "Then what else do you want to do?" Shima had thought about this. "I know plants, medicinal plants. I can make remedies, ointments. People need these things. We can sell them." Ethan considered this. It was true that the nearest doctor was 2 days away. Good remedies were always in demand. "All right," he agreed. "When spring comes, we can try." Shima nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. It wouldn't be charity. It would be fair exchange. 2 weeks later, when the snow had finally melted enough to make short trips possible, more visitors came. This time it wasn't just Thomas. Ethan was in the barn when he heard several horses. He went out and saw 5 men from town dismounting. Thomas was among them, looking uncomfortable. The others were local farmers: Bill Henderson, the Murphy brothers, and Samuel Cross, the owner of the general store. "Ethan," Samuel said, clearly the group's spokesman, "we need to talk. It's about your guests. They've been here almost 3 weeks now." Samuel cleared his throat. "Look, we all understand you help people in need. That's fine, but it's time for them to leave. The snow is melting. The roads are open." Ethan crossed his arms. "What if they're not ready to go yet?" Bill Henderson, a red-faced man, spoke harshly. "Then we make them ready." "Ethan, this isn't right. You have Apache living with you. What will people think?" "I don't care what people think." "Well, you should." Bill stepped forward. "There are families here who have lost loved ones. There's history, pain, and you're bringing these people into our community, my property." Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp as steel. "What I do here is my decision." One of the Murphy brothers, the older one, spoke more calmly. "Ethan, be reasonable. We understand your kindness, but think about them too. Do you think they'll be welcome here? Is that fair to that woman and those children?" It was a good point and it hurt because it was true. Ethan knew it. Before he could answer, the house door opened. Shima stepped out with her 3 children behind her. She stood on the porch head high, facing the men with dignity. I hear everything, she said in slow but clear Spanish. You are right, we must go. Shima, Ethan began, but she raised her hand. No, Ethan, they are right. We caused trouble for you. It is not fair. Samuel Cross looked at her, and for a moment his hard face softened. He saw what Ethan saw, a mother trying to protect her children, trying to do the right thing. Ma'am, Samuel said more gently, it's nothing personal, it's just, I understand, Shima interrupted. Tomorrow we go. Tasa began to cry. Nita clutched her mother's skirt. Kaya looked at the men with eyes full of tears but also defiance. Ethan looked at the children, at Shima standing there with all her dignity intact despite the humiliation, at the men from town, men he knew, some he even considered friends, and he made a decision. No, he said quietly but firmly, they are not leaving tomorrow. The men looked at him in surprise. Ethan, Thomas began. Shima, her children, and I have discussed this. Ethan lied smoothly. She's going to stay. She's going to work here, make medicinal remedies, help with the ranch. It's a business arrangement. Business. Bill Henderson nearly spat the word. Ethan, you're crazy. Maybe. Ethan looked each man in the eye. But it's my ranch, my land, my decision, and Shima and her children stay as long as she wants to stay. Samuel Cross studied Ethan for a long moment, then sighed. Ethan, if you do this, there will be consequences, people who won't want to trade with you, people who will turn their backs on you. So be it. The Murphy brothers exchanged glances. Thomas shook his head slowly. Bill Henderson mounted his horse with a disgusted snort. This is a mistake, Samuel said, but his voice had lost its edge. A big mistake. The men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Ethan alone in his yard with Shima and her children. When the sound of hooves faded, Shima stepped off the porch. Her eyes were wet. Why did you do that? She whispered. Now your people will hate you. Ethan looked at his ranch, his house, the land he had worked alone for 5 long years. This house has been too quiet for too long, he said simply, and you make it feel like a home again. Tasa ran to him and hugged his legs. Nita and Kaya followed. Shima hung back, but on her face was something new, hope.